The Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter.
Welcome to an episode or session of the Formed Book Club. Vivian Durido, Joseph Pierce, myself, Father Fessio. We continue our discussion of a very contemporarily useful book and a good historical book called The Lost Minute of Heaven by Geoffrey Shaw about the Diem regime in Vietnam and the Vietnamese War and how America's role in it ended up being very deleterious. But it's not just an opinion, really. This is something which he's done the research extensively to kind of finally give us a view of what actually happened.
Right. And it's good to be reminded yet again that the author, Shaw, is not a Catholic. And so this is not Catholic triumphalism that he sees Diem in the light that he does. I mean, I think it was propitious that he wasn't a Catholic when he did this research and wrote this book.
So the last chapter was about this ambassador Elbridge Durbrow, or Durbrow, or Durbro, or Durbro. Now we have another ambassador, and I have been impressed by the qualifications of these appointments, because often being ambassador is a reward you get for a big donation to the campaign. And it may have been the case here too, I don't know, but
we do see it later with Harriman.
Oh, that's true. But even he had tremendous credentials too. He was a kind of the grand old man of diplomacy.
Mm-hmm.
But he was given the right to do what he wanted.
Yeah.
All right. So this is Frederick Nolting. Vivian?
Well, as you mentioned, his credentials are so impressive, right? University of Virginia, Harvard, U.S. Navy.
Harvard Masters in Philosophy.
And that's a really important distinction. I think the reason why Nolting ends up with such a favorable view of Diem, he goes in prejudiced against him because he's gotten all the briefings and everything from everybody else, and he goes in prejudiced against him. But I think precisely because he was a man who thought of higher things, that he clicked with Diem in a way that the other career diplomats did not. And I think he was just a righteous man, Mr. Nolting, by all accounts, an upright man. And so, so he worked in the State Department for NATO. I mean, the man is really impressive. And he goes in with gets all the briefing, but he kind of goes in with an open mind, willing to learn for himself and draw his own conclusions about Diem. And then we get we get the backdrop again in terms of, that the Laotian thing is going to be a problem. And, Nolting, even because he was working for NATO, he went ahead and discussed Diem with European officials as well, right? On page 77, most of whom were stridently against him. So, I mean, we do have to, it's easy to be so critical in retrospect on what our government did and didn't do. But all the heads of state in Europe also had a bad opinion of the man. So it wasn't unusual that people were thinking this way. And we know that there were reasons why they
would think, Vivian, this man we've seen him. He goes to daily mass at 6:30 or 7 in the morning or something.
Yes.
He is not a secular modern or postmodern, post-World War II politician. He doesn't fit the mold. They're Machiavells. They're pragmatic, right? Pragmatism comes before principle. Now, clearly they won't like him, but none of this has anything to do with who he is, what he's doing, or whether he's right or wrong on the ground in Vietnam. It's all prejudice based upon an ideological disdain for Christianity in general and Catholicism in particular.
I think there's a grain of truth to that for sure. And of course, Nolting going in, he doesn't really know anything about Vietnam either. So here again, you can have all the credentials and really be quite ignorant about the situation you're entering into. And by the way, it's mentioned on 77, almost in passing, that the military man heading up Kennedy's special task force on South Vietnam, by his own admission, knew nothing about the country. And yeah, it's hard to know everything about everywhere in the world, you know? I mean,
Very few of us can do it.
I mean,
But the question is here, what do you do in that situation? If you know you're ignorant, you are either go there thinking you know better than everybody else, which you clearly don't because you're ignorant, or you are humble, right? The first thing I've got to be is on a learning curve here. I've got to find out about the culture of the country, the history of the country, what's happening on the ground. Who are these people? Try to
right.
see them as they see themselves. And then I might be able to understand them. If you just come in saying, well, clearly I'm better than you because I'm American or British, right?
Right.
Western. Therefore, that I don't really have to listen to you because you're primitive. Then at that point, I mean, there's no point of contact except the fact there's going to be alienation between the two parties.
That's right.
There's three things I will say about that. Number one, that Nolting, with the philosophical mind, was open-minded. He knew what he didn't know, and he was humble. Number two, in that situation, as you say, Joseph, you've got to inform yourself, but be very careful about with whom you surround yourself, because you can pick a few people who are sycophants or have their own agendas, and you don't get the real view there either. And then thirdly, be careful of the media. You've got to sift through the media things that you look at, because there's different points of view, and if you only have one point of view from that, you can be very biased as well. So it's true, you got to be humble, but the second step is be careful about who you're listening to.
That's right. And I think Nolting had that kind of wisdom in judging character and knowing which people to listen to. So he listened quite a bit, for example, the CIA man Lansdale, who on 78, he was the most knowledgeable member of the task force on Vietnam, even considered by Kennedy as a possible ambassador to Vietnam. And he expressed solid faith in Diem and his capabilities, and he had been persuasive in his arguments in favor of increased U.S. support for his government. And then I love this quote at the bottom of that first full paragraph on 78. According to Nolting, Lansdale, quote, did acknowledge that there are a lot of criticisms that can be leveled against this government in South Vietnam, but compared to the others in Southeast Asia, it's a beaut. I mean, can you just hear an American CIA guy talking like that? It's a beaut. So
yeah, I mean, it's not perfect. There are problems. There are things we don't agree with, but compare it with the rest out there, for goodness sake, right?
Yeah. But we see, the increasing Department of State and Department of Defense personnel not knowing anything, not the history under French rule, not Diem's accomplishments. So they're really walking into a vacuum and bringing their prejudices with them.
Yeah. And Vivian, the bottom of page 78 there, the ever increasing DOS and DOD personnel in Saigon who are making decisions more in keeping with their own career advancement than with a clear understanding of Vietnam.
Right.
Well, that's dangerous, right?
Yeah.
Everyone's, I want this to be good for me.
That's right.
Let me interject something here, which I don't want to take too far afield. But do you think that this kind of perfectionism and idealism of American culture, at least at that time, it has some kind of roots in Puritanism and the original, the settlers in New England that, you can't drink, you can't dance, you can't smoke. I mean, if you're going to be a Christian, you have to really live this very, very austere life. And anything that deviates from that is simply not tolerated. And so we come in later on and we want these countries to match our ideal of what a democracy should be in the midst of an insurgency. I don't know. Is that?
Well, I do think that we see the same sort of intolerance that we see in Puritanism in the early America. That, as Nathaniel Hawthorne obviously brings out the Scarlet Letter, we do see that sort of intolerance of different viewpoints. If they don't agree with us, lynch them, burn them, brand them. I do think we see that. So I do think there is a deep psychological Puritanism, but there's also this perverse hatred of it as well. That's the whole point. Is there's both sides of the coin. Extreme Puritanism and extreme prurience, I think, are part of the same picture. Anyway, that's a whole different tangent that's worth exploring.
Well, as far as that sort of American Puritanism affecting, with an A, American foreign policy, there's been a lot of worthy scholarship on this question, because that whole city on the hill and American exceptionalism, that does breed a sort of American myopia and American pride vis-a-vis other countries and other cultures, and also can, instead of exercising more realpolitik in the real world, we tend to pick sides ideologically according to the reigning ideology that's considered the most pure. I mean, right now it's woke ideology that's considered the pure thing that we're using to judge the other countries of the world. But so anyway, that tendency is kind of a puritanical tendency.
But to be fair, and as a caveat or even maybe a contradiction, that the British, my own people, were not that different, right? The Pax Britannica, of course the British are better than everybody else. It's obvious, right? What we're bringing to the rest of the world with the British Empire is peace, civilization, our way of seeing things, our way of doing things. So the imperialism. I don't like American imperialism, but I don't like British imperialism either. So I don't think it's. Something you have to be careful. It's not something which is purely American. I think this is those with power and pride and prejudice. Look down upon everybody else. If you have pride and prejudice and the power to use that pride and prejudice for self-empowerment, that's what happens. And it's not
Right.
just an American problem, it's a British problem, and beyond. Because
Thanks for making me feel better about being American.
Well, of course, the Puritans came from England.
That's right. That's right, Joseph. More bad on you.
You're right. Let's be woke about this. All the fault of the English.
But another great thing about Nolting, so not only does he push through all the prejudiced information he's already received and starts hearing from people on the ground in Vietnam and getting to know Diem himself, forming his own judgments, but I love this line on the bottom of 80 and spills over to the top of 81. Nolting knew that diplomats are of influencing a leader as a friend, and he refrained from pressuring heads of allied nations as if they were foes. I see a lot of practical wisdom and respect in this man, right?
Yeah.
Don't push people around.
It was you, Vivian, our father, that pointed out the importance of the fact that he got a philosophy from Harvard. This is a man who thinks about truth.
Yeah.
Right. Not pragmatism, but principle.
Right. Another thing that comes out strongly, not only Nolting's good opinion of Diem, but Lyndon Johnson, Vice President Lyndon Johnson's opinion of Diem. Johnson went to Vietnam himself personally. He wanted to see this thing for himself, and he too came to the conclusion that whatever his faults, Diem was the best man for the job, and we needed to give him our full support. That comes out in this chapter as well.
Yeah.
So here's Nolting in what he's saying, page 85, top of 85. After being in Saigon for approximately 3 months, Nolting sent a telegram to Department of State expressing his understanding of the situation in Vietnam. Diem was not a dictator who relished power for his own sake. Nolting said, in fact, Diem was almost monk-like in his dedication to high principles, and as such, not a typical politician who enjoyed the exercise of power and its privileges. His philosophy was sound and compatible with American interests, although a little over the heads of most Vietnamese, and his objectives were reasonable.
The only thing I would say to that, by the way, also over the heads of most Americans.
I have a question just following that. The little paragraph where Nolting concurred with Diem's self-assessment, but feared that because the leader was so exemplary and quite irreplaceable, he would prove to be a weakness for South Vietnam and U.S. involvement there. Now, why is that a weakness? Because you're exemplary and irreplaceable.
Well, because
Well,
you can be assassinated or removed, and then once that vacuum is created, you have the chaos or war will enter the vacuum. That's what happened, of course. If he wasn't evacuated, wasn't assassinated. Sorry, he was actually taken out by his allies, and we saw
So the weakness is you're too good and you're taken out. There's nothing to take your place. Is that
right. That's how.
exactly. Once you create
okay?
that vacuum, then you have the chaos that ensued. That's what we see happens.
I'll erase my question mark on the side of the page there. That's good.
In short, he was vulnerable to both communist and non-communist enemies. Everybody was going to have him in their targets, his targets, and once he was gone, it was going to be really bad. And that's exactly
Yeah,
what
I don't want to make a saint of him because that's not for me to do. But there's a parallel. There's an analogy here with Jesus Christ. All right, that you have you have Caesar, you have the Pharisees, you have people from all sides that don't like him because he's the one that really is showing the lie to all of you.
Yeah.
To the communists, to the capitalists, to the materialists, to the cynics. It's a man of principle, in power, not corrupted by it, who's willing to lay down his life for what he sees to be the truth. And
Yep.
that is, that's something which is not going to be tolerated by the worldly.
That's right. And here Nolting also went out with Diem into the countryside where the war was really being fought and where the hearts and minds of people were going to be won or lost. And what does he see? He sees a Vietnamese leader at ease with his people. His interest and expertise in farming, fishing, and all manner of practical things proved
Where
that
is this, Vivian? Sorry,
this is
where is
the top of 86.
Thank you.
Proved that the picture of Diem as an aloof Mandarin was utterly false. Yet this false picture, manufactured by his enemies, was spreading in the news media, and it was hurting Diem and his administration. Nolting warned that Diem could not afford to let the slander drag on indefinitely, or he would suffer from another coup attempt or worse. He said Diem had to make a public relations breakthrough. And as we know, he never did.
Well, because he's not going to put on a false smile and kiss a baby, right?
Yep.
I mean, he's living the life, right? He's walking the walk.
And then again, the last paragraph on that page, according to Colby, another CIA man, Nolting was one of the few Americans who understood that the war for Vietnam was not like that fought in Korea, a conventional soldiers' war. The ambassador discerned from his earliest days in Saigon that the main battles were political and needed to be won in the villages. The key to winning over the Vietnamese villages was not Western-style democracy, which was an alien concept. Thus, Nolting understood the leaders of South Vietnam could not be expected to do our will, as Americans are wont to expect foreigners to do. They had to assert their nationalism if they were to contest the nationalist appeal that the enemy was offering, meaning what the communists were offering.
And I've got this irony here, of course, bearing in mind Pope Leo XIII and Pius XI, both of whom precede this, with what they taught about subsidiarity. The communists are those who are teaching and preaching subsidiarity here, right? We don't want some outside power that's much more powerful than we are dictating to us what we should be doing. We should be doing it ourselves. There's a real irony here. I mean, it's almost comic in a tragic sense,
Right, because they're preaching one thing, but as soon as communists take power, they do the absolute opposite and centralize power. And here Diem is having to make all these political trade-offs with his enemies, even his domestic enemies, all the while trying to empower the people. And yet he's the one who's called the dictator.
I know. Ironic.
So is that it for the chapter? Nolting, he'll be around next chapter too.
We have 10 minutes or so left, so why not go for it?
Let's go to Laos or Laos. whichever you prefer.
I say Laos.
Laos. Laos. Okay, you like Laos. Okay, that's good. I have a vague memory of knowing that somehow Laos was important, but this really crystallized it, or brought it back clearly. How important that was in the war, that we wanted them to be neutral, and of course, we did not allow any. We didn't agree to have any verification of that. And so the North Vietnamese used that as a corridor into South Vietnam, into their flank. I mean, that was horrible.
Yep. To see how important Laos is, all you have to do is look at a map. Another thing Americans don't do very often. It runs the whole length of North and South Vietnam. And so if you're going to go for a diplomatic solution, which JFK decided to do because the alternatives were just too horrible, including tactical nuclear war and all these things, well, then as you said, the key is going to be enforcing the treaty. If you're not going to enforce the treaty and the communists are going to be able to use Laos for their own ends, and Diem is handcuffed and defending himself against them, this is over.
And actually, Diem made to look like a tyrant or for refusing to sign a treaty which he knew was basically a conduit for communist advancement. And his refusal would be seen as, he's the only unreasonable person in this.
Right.
I mean, it was a horrible situation. And again, it's perfectly example of the successful Machiavellianism of the communists, that they got the agreement, everyone agreed upon the Soviets, but as long as it wasn't going to be policed, who cared?
Right.
That was the point. As long as no one was going to police it, who cares what agreement signed? And the point is that nobody had the will, and there was nothing in the agreement which insisted that we have to police this.
That's right.
Enforce it.
Well, in fact, it was left up to the Soviet. I mean, think about this. Supposedly, these Sovietologists are working on this agreement, and it's going to be left up to the Soviets to police the communists?
Yeah.
What?
That's the whole point. We can't fault Kennedy for wanting to avoid a repeat of Korea or a nuclear war. So
That's right.
Fair enough. Look for a diplomatic. Look for a via media, but don't be duped and stupid about it once you start doing it. I mean,
exactly.
You've got to be sensible now, right? We've got to make sure this works.
Yep.
When I was young and naive, and I think the world was a little simpler place in terms of political factions and polarization, Eisenhower being president, we like Ike, and you had this face of this smiling, successful general, balding and everything. But in reading this book, I've come to appreciate Eisenhower even more.
Yes.
He says here on page 90, just before that new paragraph there, Eisenhower also told the council to inform the press that America would not allow Laos to fall into the communists, even if such prevention meant the United States had to act alone, that is, without the agreement of our allies. And at the bottom of the page there, President Eisenhower said with considerable emotion that Laos was the key to the entire area of Southeast Asia. Boy, was he right.
It was. And his doctrine, his Eisenhower doctrine was, which we spelled out on page 87, the first page of this chapter, he promised to commit U.S. forces to protect the territorial integrity and political independence of countries threatened by aggression from any nation controlled by international communism. And now this promise is JFK inherits when he becomes president of the United States, and yet he's given no militarily reasonable option for doing that in Vietnam's case or Laos's case. So that's why he goes for the diplomatic solution. But I want to just point out our attention to what this Hillman, Roger Hillsman
said. He's good. He's good. I like him.
So another, this is why this whole thing is a Shakespearean tragedy. You have a lot of really fine men working on these problems. There are a lot of very fine men, but these problems and human weakness being what it is, The problems are just unsolvable. So anyway, this Roger Hilsman, right? He's a West Point graduate. He'd been involved in guerrilla combat in World War II. Now notice how the men who understand guerrilla warfare throughout this whole drama are the men who understand what needs to be done to win Vietnam. So here's another one. And what does he say on the bottom of that first paragraph on 93?
Yeah.
Protect the people. Don't chase the Viet Cong. Just use the troops to protect the people. Then behind the screen, you have social and political reform. Well, that's exactly the counterinsurgency plan that Diem was trying to follow. But he was always up against conventional warfare people who wanted to build big armies and throw them into battle against the other army. And here's another guy with guerrilla warfare experience. No. You have to protect and secure the people. That's how you win their hearts and minds. They can live in safety and security and farm their land.
You mentioned the Shakespearean connection here. And I think the tragedy here is that you have really good men like Roger Hilsman, but they don't have power. They have wisdom without power. You have Harriman, who has power and an ideology and whatever else. And it's as if those with wisdom are almost speaking. It's the opposite of Munch's painting the scream. They're not screaming in a vacuum. They are actually enunciating wisdom in a vacuum. But nobody's listening because nobody can hear because the voices with power drown them out.
Another interesting man with guerrilla warfare wisdom coming to play in here. Did you notice the reference to T.E. Lawrence? Lawrence of Arabia.
Lawrence of amazing, astonishing.
Lawrence of Arabia. And yet, who's reading Lawrence of Arabia? The Americans should be. But it's the Viet Cong who are reading him. That to me was a supreme irony. So it's this.
What page?
This is page 95. It starts with the description of this General Giap he's on the North Vietnamese side, and he's one of Ho Chi Minh's generals. And here he is on page 96. It's written that. So here's also a man who reads, right? A man who reads and tries to understand. He religiously studied Lenin, Marx, Engels, Mao to understand the nature of revolutionary warfare. He nevertheless admitted to the French general Raoul Salan that he had discovered the secrets of successful guerrilla warfare from the British soldier T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia. His seminal work, The Seven Pillars of Wisdom, gave Giap practical examples of how to apply minimum military force to maximum tactical and strategic effect. You know what? Every general working on the Vietnam issue should have been reading T.E. Lawrence too. But they weren't.
This is the dark side of subsidiarity, all right? That you have the imperial. Because the other thing, by the way, that Giap is also a great admirer of Napoleon, right? Napoleon Bonaparte. So you have the Napoleon Bonaparte, the one with all the power, with the big army, who imposes his will with military brilliance, all right? But then you have the opposite of that, the guerrilla warfare. How to have maximum military force, apply minimum military force for maximum tactical and strategic effect. Well, that's the dark underbelly of subsidiarity, right? We don't have the power, but what we can do with the little power we have is to create maximum chaos. This is the philosophy of the terrorist, right? The war. I think it's called the war of the flea, right? If you're not the dog and you can't fight the dog because you're only a flea, well, you bite, right? You bite the dog. So this whole idea of a dark subsidiarist approach, guerrilla warfare. I mean, the Americans did it against the Brits. You started
That's right.
it.
Terrorism is a tactic. When you're fighting asymmetrical war, it's a tactic. So it was a big mistake after the Twin Towers, for America to be declaring war on terror. No, name your enemy. Terror is not your enemy. terror is a tactic.
Right, and then looking for a scapegoat, which is looking in the wrong direction and making yourself look
Yeah.
silly for mass destruction that weren't found. I mean, it was the reaction becomes the. It's exactly the same thing.
Yes.
You provoke not just a reaction, but an overreaction, and the overreaction actually brings a bigger victory than the initial terrorist act.
And we invade Iraq with this massive conventional army approach, and completely obliterate the place. Oh, and what happens? Well, we don't need to go there, but the other interesting thing about this General Giap, a communist you can respect, right? Qualities he understood, he had manifested qualities of a Confucian philosopher leader. He respected Sun Tzu's martial thought. He had incredible patience and a long-term view. There's a lot of practical wisdom here. And what a shame that it's in the hands of the communists who, once they win, we know what's going to happen to Vietnam. Wow. This is like a drama of all these characters. It's
also, it's actually maybe providential. It's a great sequel to the drama of atheist humanism, which we just finished. Right, we've just been looking at the panorama, the philosophical landscape, which laid the foundations for the Marxism in the 20th century. This is how it plays itself out.
Yes.
This is how humanism plays itself out. These philosophers have ideas, these people put it into practice, and this is what it means.
Let us conclude with that, because we're not going to finish this chapter. We'll begin next time with the middle of this chapter on page 98. Thanks, everyone, for watching and listening. God bless you.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.